Garrett Hale built his life around power, control, and predictability. Nothing ever caught him off guard, until the moment two identical 6-year-old girls appeared before him, their wide blue eyes locked onto his. "Sir, we're lost," one of them said. The other nodded. "And we were looking for you." Garrett froze, his mind racing. Looking for him? Before he could process what was happening, he exhaled sharply. "All right," he muttered. "Let's figure this out." Garrett moved quickly down the sidewalk, his eyes fixed ahead as he checked his watch. He was running late for a meeting, something that almost never happened. His life was built on discipline and control, and tardiness was a weakness he didn't tolerate, especially in himself. His driver was already waiting by the curb, the sleek black car gleaming under the late afternoon sun. Just as he reached for the door handle, a small voice stopped him. "Sir." Garrett turned sharply, frowning. Standing just a few feet away were two little girls, no older than 6. They had identical dark curls framing their small faces, and their striking blue eyes, unmistakably the same shade as his own, stared up at him with a mix of uncertainty and determination. His first instinct was to look around, searching for a frantic parent or guardian. But the sidewalk was mostly empty. The girls were alone. "Are you lost?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. One of them hesitated, biting her lip before shaking her head. The other, who looked slightly more confident, took a step forward. "We were looking for you." Garrett stiffened, his grip on the car door tightening. That was not the answer he had expected. "You were looking for me," he repeated, his voice controlled. Both girls nodded at the same time. Garrett felt an odd sense of unease settle in his chest. Children didn't just go searching for corporate CEOs. Something about this situation wasn't right. "Where are your parents?" he asked. The Boulder twin hesitated for a fraction of a second before replying. "At home." Garrett narrowed his eyes. "Do they know you're here?" This time, the answer didn't come as quickly. The quieter twin shifted slightly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her small backpack. The slight guilt on her face told him everything he needed to know. "No," she admitted softly. Garrett exhaled slowly, glancing between the two of them. They didn't seem scared, which only made the situation more puzzling. If they weren't lost, and if their parents didn't know they were here, then why had they come? "And why exactly were you looking for me?" he asked, crossing his arms. The girls exchanged a glance. The one who had spoken more pulled something out of her backpack and held it out to him. It was an old photograph. Garrett took it, his breath catching in his throat as his gaze fell on the image. It was him, years younger, dressed in a casual button-down shirt, standing beside a woman with soft brown eyes and dark curls. He knew this picture. He knew her. Mallory Carter, a name he hadn't thought about in years. His eyes flicked back to the twins, a cold sensation running down his spine. "She's our mom," the girl said quietly. Garrett's pulse pounded in his ears. He looked down at the photograph again, then back at the two little girls with identical blue eyes. For the first time in years, Garrett Hale had no idea what to say. Garrett stared at the photograph in his hand, his fingers tightening around its worn edges. The image was slightly faded, but there was no mistaking the two people in it. Him and Mallory. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't even thought about her in a long time. Yet here he was, standing on a busy sidewalk, confronted by two little girls who claimed she was their mother. His mind raced through the possibilities, searching for an explanation that made sense. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they had the wrong person. Maybe this was some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. But as he looked at them again, those wide blue eyes staring up at him with quiet anticipation, he knew deep down that it wasn't a mistake at all. "Where's your mother now?" he asked, his voice controlled, but not as steady as usual. "At home," the Boulder twin said. Garrett felt something shift inside him. "She doesn't know you're here, does she?" The quieter girl hesitated before shaking her head. "We wanted to find you." His grip on the photo tightened as he processed their words. Mallory hadn't sent them. They had come on their own, which meant she either hadn't told them about him or hadn't expected them to ever meet him. Either way, they had found him. And now, two 6-year-old girls stood in front of him, expecting something from him that he wasn't sure he could give. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, running a hand through his dark curls. He wasn't used to dealing with children, let alone two, who had tracked him down like this. Your mother must be worried sick. The first twin, Lily, as he later learned, shifted slightly. We thought she wouldn't notice. Garrett let out a slow breath, pinching the bridge of his nose. He had built his life on structure, control, and calculated decisions. Nothing in his world was ever left to chance. But this, two little girls showing up out of nowhere, with eyes that mirrored his own, this wasn't something he could have planned for. How did you even find me? He finally asked. Sophie, the quieter twin, pulled something else from her backpack, a piece of paper folded several times. She handed it to him. As he unfolded it, he immediately recognized what it was. A printed copy of his company's address. Garrett frowned. Where did you get this? In a box in Mom's closet, Lily admitted. She had some letters and papers. We saw your name and looked it up. Garrett inhaled deeply, trying to contain the growing frustration inside him. They had gone through Mallory's things. They had found his name. And now they had found him. And he had no idea what to do next. Going through Mallory's things, they had found his name and somehow managed to make their way here without her knowing. That alone was reckless. But what weighed on him more was the fact that Mallory had clearly kept traces of him in her life, even if she had never reached out. You should have told her where you were going, he finally said. We didn't think you'd be mad, Sophie said, frowning slightly. We just wanted to know who you were. Her words cut deeper than Garrett expected. He had spent years avoiding connections, avoiding anything that tied him down. He had never considered what might have happened after he and Mallory went their separate ways. He had never once thought that there could be two little girls growing up without knowing who he was. And now they were here. You know now, he said, his voice quieter. What happens next? The girls exchanged glances before Lily spoke. Can we talk to Mom first? Garrett exhaled. That was the only thing that made sense. He couldn't stand here on the sidewalk with two lost children and pretend he knew what to do next. Get in the car, he said, nodding toward his sleek black vehicle. I'm taking you home. As they climbed in, Garrett took his place behind the wheel, gripping it tightly. He had come here expecting a routine business meeting. Instead, he was driving two little girls, his daughters, back to a woman he hadn't seen in almost 7 years. And for the first time in his life, he had no idea what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. The drive to the girls' home was quiet, but not the comfortable silence Garrett was used to. This silence felt heavy, full of questions he wasn't ready to ask and answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. In the back seat, Lily and Sophie sat still, their small frames barely filling the luxurious leather seats of his car. They didn't seem scared, which surprised him. If anything, they looked expectant, like they had always known he would take them home. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he turned onto a familiar street. He hadn't been here in years, but nothing had changed. The row of townhouses, the tree-lined sidewalk, the small neighborhood park at the end of the block. It all felt frozen in time. He pulled up to a modest but well-kept house and parked in the driveway. The moment he shut off the engine, the front door flew open. Mallory stood on the porch, her dark brown hair pulled back in a messy bun, her face pale with worry. The instant she saw the twins in the back seat, her expression shifted from fear to relief, then to something much sharper, anger. Before Garrett could even step out of the car, she was already moving toward them, her footsteps quick and full of purpose. Lily, Sophie, her voice was breathless, desperate. What were you thinking? As soon as Garrett unlocked the doors, both girls scrambled out. They ran straight to their mother, heads ducked in guilt as she pulled them into a tight hug. We're sorry, Mom, Sophie mumbled against her shoulder. We just wanted to see him, Lily added softly. Mallory squeezed them tighter before pulling back, her hands gripping their arms, gently but firmly. You scared me half to death, she said, her voice breaking. You can't just run off like that. Garrett stood beside his car, watching the scene unfold. He had prepared himself for anger, for accusations, but he hadn't been ready for the raw emotion in Mallory's eyes when she looked at her daughters. Finally, she straightened, her gaze snapping to him. What are you doing here? She asked, her tone laced with suspicion. Garrett met her eyes, keeping his voice even. They came to find me. I brought them home. Mallory exhaled sharply, rubbing her temple. Of course they did. She turned back to the girls. Go inside. Now. Lily and Sophie hesitated, casting one last glance at Garrett before nodding. They walked toward the house, their heads down, leaving the two adults standing in tense silence. Once the front door closed behind them, Mallory crossed her arms. So, she said, her voice low and controlled. Now you know. Garrett nodded slowly. Yeah, now I know. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. Took you long enough. His jaw clenched. You never told me, Mallory. Her expression hardened. Would it have made a difference? Garrett didn't have an answer to that, and the fact that he didn't frustrated him more than anything. Mallory sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. Garrett hesitated on the porch, glancing at Mallory. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was firm. Come inside. After a brief pause, he followed her up the steps. The house was warm and lived in. It wasn't large, but it felt full of life. Children's drawings were pinned to the fridge, a laundry basket rested by the couch, and a few toys lay scattered near the stairs. A comforting mix of cinnamon and something floral lingered in the air, stirring something deep in his chest. Mallory gestured toward the kitchen. Sit. Garrett pulled out a chair at the small wooden table, watching as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She turned to him. Do you want one? No. She shrugged and took a sip before sitting across from him. A heavy silence stretched between them before she finally set her cup down and met his gaze. I never planned on you finding out. Garrett exhaled slowly. Why? A humorless chuckle escaped her. You're really asking me that? Yes, Mallory, I am. His voice was steady but firm. You had to know I would have wanted to know. She stared at him for a long moment before speaking. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought about telling you. I really did. But you were already gone, Garrett. You were building your career, making a name for yourself. And I knew what would happen if I told you. His brow furrowed. What do you mean? She leaned back, folding her arms. You would have felt obligated, she said simply. Not because you wanted to, but because it was the right thing to do. And I didn't want that. I didn't want you in their life out of duty. I wanted you there because you wanted to be. Garrett clenched his jaw. That wasn't your decision to make. Maybe not, Mallory admitted, but I made it anyway. Silence settled between them again, heavier this time. From the living room, he could hear the faint voices of two girls upstairs, his daughters. I want to be in their lives, he said finally. Mallory studied him carefully. Why now? Because I should have been there from the start, he said, and because they came looking for me. That has to mean something. She traced the rim of her coffee cup with her finger, her voice softer now. They've always wondered about you. I never lied to them. I just never gave them answers. And I think that only made them more curious. Garrett nodded slowly. Mallory took a deep breath. All right, she said. If you really want to be in their lives, then prove it. His eyes sharpened. How? She gave him a small, tired smile. Show up. It was such a simple challenge, but somehow it felt like the hardest one. Garrett had spent years showing up for meetings, negotiations, and multi-million-dollar contracts. But this was different. This time, he wasn't proving himself to a boardroom. He was proving himself to them. The drive back to his penthouse was quiet, but his thoughts were anything but. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as Mallory's words replayed in his head. She had kept them from him. His daughters. The anger he had felt in her kitchen still lingered, simmering beneath the surface. But beneath that was something deeper, guilt. Because no matter how much he wanted to be furious, he couldn't ignore the truth. She had been right about one thing. Back then, he wouldn't have known what to do. He had been too focused on his career, too obsessed with proving himself in the corporate world. If she had told him, would he have made the right choice? He didn't know. And that uncertainty was worse than the anger. When he pulled into the underground parking garage of his building, he exhaled slowly, trying to clear his thoughts. He stepped out of the car and headed straight for the elevator, barely acknowledging the doorman's greeting. His penthouse was just as he had left it, pristine. silent, untouched. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline. It was the kind of view people dreamed of, but right now, it felt empty. He walked to the bar and poured himself a glass of whiskey, staring out at the city as he took a slow sip. His mind drifted back to earlier, the way Lily and Sophie had looked at him when they asked who he was, the way they clung to Mallory when they realized she was upset. They weren't just two random children. They were his. The thought sent a strange, unfamiliar sensation through him. This wasn't like business. It wasn't something he could strategize his way through. He had spent years making decisions that shaped entire industries, but he had never made a decision as important as this one. Could he do this? Would they even want him to? The sharp buzz of his phone pulled him from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Mallory. He hesitated for only a second before answering. Yeah, a pause. Then, the girls won't stop talking about you. Garrett ran a hand through his curls. Is that a good thing? She let out a soft laugh, though there was something tired beneath it. I don't know yet. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she sighed. Look, today was a lot for all of us. But if you're serious about being in their lives, I need to know that you'll really be there. Not just today. Not just when it's convenient. Garrett leaned against the counter, staring at the dark liquid in his glass. I meant what I said. I want to be there. Another pause. Then, in a quieter voice, then prove it. Garrett frowned slightly. How? Come back tomorrow, Mallory said simply. Spend time with them. Get to know them. He inhaled slowly, then nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Okay. Okay, she echoed. Then I'll see you tomorrow. Tomorrow. She ended the call before he could say anything else. Garrett set his phone down and took another slow sip of whiskey. For the first time in his life, he was stepping into something he couldn't control, something uncertain, something messy. But for some reason, it didn't scare him as much as it should have. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about deals, profits, or power. He was thinking about them. The next afternoon, Garrett arrived at Mallory's house earlier than planned. He sat in his car for a moment, staring at the front door, feeling an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. Then, with a deep breath, he got out, and he knocked. Garrett had faced ruthless executives, sealed billion-dollar deals, and navigated boardrooms filled with men who would sell their own families for profit. Yet, nothing had ever made him feel as unprepared as this moment. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked up to the porch. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Lily stood there, blinking up at him, surprise flickering across her face. You're here. Garrett arched an eyebrow. You sound like you weren't expecting me. She shrugged. Mom said you would come, but Sophie thought you might change your mind. Something about that struck a nerve. And what did you think? Lily tilted her head, considering. I figured if you really wanted to be here, you'd come early. Garrett smirked slightly. Then I guess I passed the test. Before Lily could respond, Sophie appeared behind her, staring at him for a moment before turning her head slightly. Mom, he's actually here. Mallory's voice drifted in from the kitchen. Let him in before you keep making announcements, Sophie. The twins stepped aside, and Garrett walked in. The warmth of the house settled around him, the air carrying a sweet scent of cinnamon and vanilla. The living room was tidy but lived in. Picture frames on the shelves, a blanket draped over the couch, a few scattered toys near the staircase. It was nothing like the cold, minimalist penthouse he returned to every night. Mallory emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She glanced at the clock before giving him an approving look. You're early. Garrett shrugged. Lily said that was the only way to prove I wanted to be here. Mallory smiled faintly, shaking her head. They're tougher than they look. Lily grinned. We get it from Mom. Mallory rolled her eyes. All right, enough ganging up on him. You two get your coats. We're going out. Garrett raised an eyebrow. We are. Mallory nodded. If you're serious about getting to know them, sitting awkwardly in my living room isn't the best way to do it. He couldn't argue with that. A few minutes later, they were in his car, heading toward the park. The girls chattered in the back seat, sometimes to him, sometimes to each other. filling the silence in a surprisingly comfortable way. "So, you're rich, right?" Sophie asked suddenly. Garrett glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "Something like that." Lily leaned forward slightly. "How rich?" Mallory sighed. "Girls." "What?" Lily said innocently. "It's a fair question." Garrett smirked. "Rich enough." Sophie squinted at him. "Rich enough to have a pet tiger?" Garrett chuckled. "Why would I need a tiger?" Lily shrugged. "Because you're a CEO. CEOs do weird things sometimes." Mallory groaned. "Please don't assume every CEO is a lunatic." Sophie crossed her arms. "Then what's the point of being rich if you don't have something cool?" Garrett thought for a moment. "I have a plane." The twins exchanged wide-eyed glances. "You have a plane?" Lily asked. Garrett nodded. "And a helicopter." Sophie's mouth dropped open. "Can we ride in it?" Mallory turned in her seat. "Absolutely not." Garrett smirked. "Maybe someday." The twins whispered excitedly to each other while Mallory shot him a warning glare. He just shrugged, amused at how quickly they had latched onto the idea. At the park, the girls ran ahead, their laughter filling the crisp autumn air. Garrett stood beside Mallory, watching them climb onto the swings. "They like you," she said after a moment. Garrett glanced at her. "Yeah." Mallory nodded. "But they don't trust easily. If you're going to be in their lives, don't make promises you can't keep." Garrett's jaw tightened. "I don't break promises." Mallory studied him, as if deciding whether she could believe that. After a long pause, she nodded. "Good." They stood in silence, watching as Sophie leaped off the swing with a triumphant laugh, followed quickly by Lily. For the first time in years, Garrett felt something shift inside him. And for once, he wasn't afraid of it. The days that followed were unlike anything Garrett had ever experienced. His usual routine, structured, disciplined, and predictable, had been completely upended by two small forces of nature named Lily and Sophie. Instead of back-to-back meetings and high-stakes negotiations, he found himself answering rapid-fire questions about everything from his favorite food to whether he had ever fought a shark. He had expected them to be distant, hesitant, but that wasn't how they worked. They were careful at first, studying him like something unfamiliar. But once they decided he wasn't going anywhere, they wasted no time, making him part of their world. It was overwhelming, and strangely, he didn't mind. On the fourth day, Mallory called him. He had just finished reviewing a contract when he picked up, leaning back in his office chair. "They won't stop asking when you're coming back," she said before he could even greet her. Garrett smirked, glancing at the clock. "Miss me already?" Mallory snorted. "Not me. Them." He hesitated for just a second before answering. "I'll be there in an hour." When he arrived at the house, the front door opened before he could knock. Lily and Sophie barreled out, their faces lighting up as they grabbed his hands. "Mom said we could go get ice cream," Sophie announced. "Can we?" Lily asked, looking up at him with wide, hopeful eyes. Garrett raised an eyebrow. "You do realize it's almost dinner time, right?" Lily nodded solemnly. "That's why we have to go before Mom changes her mind." Mallory appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. "I never agreed to before dinner." Lily and Sophie turned identical, pleading gazes on their mother, eyes wide with dramatic innocence. Mallory sighed. "Fine, but small portions." The girls cheered as Garrett led them to the car. The drive was filled with endless chatter, with Lily and Sophie debating the best ice cream flavors. "Chocolate is obviously the best," Lily declared. "That's so basic," Sophie argued. "Mint chocolate chip is better." Garrett smirked. "You know, I'm more of a vanilla guy myself." Both girls gasped in exaggerated horror. Mallory, from the passenger seat, shook her head. "And you want to be a part of their lives?" Garrett laughed, something that still felt strange coming so naturally. "Guess I'll just have to earn my place." Garrett was still getting used to his new routine. It was different from anything he had ever known. Unpredictable, messy, but surprisingly natural. His life had always been structured, every hour accounted for, but now his days were filled with unexpected phone calls from Lily and Sophie, invitations to spend time together, and an unspoken expectation that he would actually show up. And he did. At first, He assumed the twins would treat him like an outsider, someone unfamiliar who had suddenly entered their world. But instead, they pulled him right in without hesitation. They had opinions about everything: what kind of shoes he should wear, which movies he needed to watch, even how he should style his hair. He thought it would be exhausting, but instead, it felt grounding. One evening, he sat in Mallory's kitchen, watching Lily and Sophie attempt to teach him how to braid hair using one of their dolls. As he fumbled with the synthetic strands, laughter filled the room. He realized something unsettling. He didn't want this to be temporary. He had always believed that work was the most important thing, that love and family were distractions, and that emotions only made a man weak. But now, sitting here with two 6-year-olds laughing at his clumsy attempt at braiding, he couldn't remember why he had ever thought that way. Mallory leaned against the counter, her expression amused. "They've got you wrapped around their little fingers." Garrett smirked. "I don't know what you're talking about." Sophie looked up. "He's actually not that bad at braiding." Lily nodded in agreement. "Yeah, for a beginner." Mallory shook her head. "They're just being nice. That braid is a disaster." Garrett sighed, setting the doll down. "Fine, I accept defeat." Sophie grinned. "You'll get better with practice." The thought settled into his chest, warm, unfamiliar, but welcome. Later, after the twins had gone to bed, Garrett stayed behind. Mallory handed him a cup of tea, just like she always used to when things were simpler between them. He held the cup, studying her carefully. "You're letting me in," he said quietly. Mallory exhaled, crossing her arms. "I guess I am." "Why?" She hesitated before answering. "Because I see the way they look at you. They like having you around." She glanced toward the hallway, where the twins' bedroom was. "And I think they need you." Garrett swallowed, feeling the weight of her words. "And what about you?" Mallory let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "I don't know yet." He nodded, setting his cup down. "That's fair." For a moment, they sat in silence. The tension that had existed between them for weeks was finally fading. "You're really staying, aren't you?" she asked. Garrett met her gaze. "Yeah, I am." For the first time, she didn't challenge him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for an escape. The realization hit him again as he stood in Mallory's kitchen a week later, helping Lily and Sophie decorate cupcakes for their upcoming birthday. The kitchen smelled like vanilla, and laughter filled the space. The twins were covered in flour and frosting, their small hands making a mess of the counter as they carefully placed colorful sprinkles on top of each cupcake. Garrett had tried to help, but after accidentally smudging blue icing on Sophie's nose and getting scolded by Lily for ruining the aesthetic, he had been demoted to cleanup duty. "You're taking this very seriously," Garrett said, watching Lily examine a cupcake like a professional critic. "It has to be perfect," she said, adjusting the sprinkles carefully. "It's our birthday." Sophie licked some frosting off her fingers. "I think they look fine." "Fine isn't good enough," Lily muttered. Garrett smirked. "Sounds like someone I know." Mallory, watching from across the kitchen, raised an eyebrow. "Wonder where she gets that from." Lily and Sophie finished decorating and hopped down from their stools, satisfied with their work. "Can we show them to Mom?" Sophie asked excitedly. Garrett realized that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't planning an escape or searching for control. He was here, present, and exactly where he wanted to be. Garrett nodded. "Go ahead." The girls ran off, their laughter trailing behind them. As soon as they were out of sight, Mallory turned to Garrett, crossing her arms. "So, birthday presents?" Garrett leaned against the counter. "What about them?" Mallory gave him a knowing look. "You're planning on spoiling them, aren't you?" Garrett smirked. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Garrett." He sighed, lifting his hands in surrender. "Fine. I may have gone a little overboard." Mallory rolled her eyes. "How overboard?" "Let's just say there may be a pony involved." She groaned. "You bought them a pony?" Garrett smirked. "Technically, I haven't bought it yet." Mallory covered her face with her hands. "I can't believe this." "They deserve something special," he said, his voice softer now. Mallory dropped her hands and met his gaze. "They don't need grand gestures, Garrett. They need you. He held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. After a long pause, he nodded. I know. Mallory sighed but didn't argue. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway where the girls had disappeared. They really love having you here, you know. Garrett swallowed. I love being here. Mallory hesitated for a moment, then gave him a small smile. Then stay. Garrett didn't answer right away. He didn't have to, because in his heart, he already knew he wasn't leaving. Not now. Not ever. This story is more than just a tale about a billionaire discovering he has children. It's about responsibility, redemption, and the realization that true success isn't measured in wealth, but in the relationships we build. Garrett starts as a man who believes he has control over everything, his career, his emotions, his future. But the arrival of Lily and Sophie changes everything he thought he knew. At first, he struggles, unsure of how to fit into their world. Yet, as the story unfolds, he realizes that being a father isn't about grand gestures or financial security. It's about showing up. Lily and Sophie, despite being only 6, are not just passive characters in his transformation. They are the ones who push him to grow, who demand honesty and presence. Their innocence and curiosity force Garrett to confront the choices he's made and the life he's been avoiding. Mallory, too, plays a crucial role in his journey. She's not just the mother of his children. She's a reminder of who he used to be and a challenge to who he can become. Her reluctance to let him back into their lives isn't about resentment. It's about protecting the daughter she raised alone. The beauty of the ending isn't in perfection, but in progress. Garrett doesn't suddenly become the perfect father overnight, nor does Mallory immediately trust him. What makes the ending powerful is that he chooses to stay. He chooses to show up day after day, proving not just to Mallory and the girls, but to himself that he wants to be part of this family. The final moment, when he realizes he's not just someone passing through their lives, but someone who belongs there, is what makes the story truly meaningful. Because in the end, Garrett Hale doesn't just gain daughters. He gains a reason to live beyond his empire.